All right, so good afternoon, folks. Before we get started with our program, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must keep in mind the ongoing effects of colonization, community struggle for self-determination, colonial state violence, and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brianna Tetch. I go by she, her, hers, and I'm a social work student here. And I'm also the student union president for the 2020 academic year. As social workers, it is imperative that we are engaged in politics because of how policies affect the communities and individuals we work with. Understanding how to be political social workers could not be any more timely than now, with the impending presidential and numerous local elections upon us. The NASW Code of Ethics states, exercising the right to vote is one of the most powerful ways that we advocate for our profession's mission. It is our ethical responsibility as professionals to be civically engaged and informed voters. Politics is personal. It is important that we have a representative democracy, and I feel inspired by the many folks before me who paved the way for people like us to be in political office. I look forward to seeing more social workers active in the political arena as our experiences are insightful and our social justice lens is valuable.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Okay, we excited? Good. All right, I'm Justin Hodge. I'm a clinical assistant professor here at the School of Social Work. If you've had any conversations with me at all, you probably know how important I think it is for social workers to be engaged in policy and political work. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Shannon Lane with us here today. I'm going to read you her bio in a moment, but among her many accomplishments, she wrote the first textbook on political social work. You've probably seen this on the advertisements around the school on the electronic banners. If you are, after the talk, enthused and want to buy the book, you can get 20% off if you pick up one of these. I'm going to have that over there for you. There's a QR code or a string of letters and numbers you can throw in there. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Shannon Lane. So she's an associate professor of social work at Yeshiva University, and after receiving her MSW from our program here, go blue, she worked on Capitol Hill for a decade before going on to earn her PhD in social work from the University of Connecticut. Dr. Lane has taught political social work, policy, macro practice, and research at 4 different universities. Since 2004, she's been affiliated with the Nancy Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. So if you know campaign school, you've seen those advertisements. Who's going to campaign school on Saturday? Yep, there we go, okay. She is integral in that. So she's worked with the Humphreys Institute to coordinate campaign school. It's a 2-day training event that has trained more than 1,800 social workers now. It's a lot. And we're gonna be pushing 2,000 after this weekend. And other professionals from around the country to run for political office and to hold leadership positions in political settings. So this event was made possible by the generous support of our school space and other resources, as well as grant funding from the Center for the Education of Women Plus, the Francis and Sidney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, as well as the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching Instructional Development Fund. Do we have anybody from CRLT or CEW Plus here? Well, we thank them for their generous support for this. All right, well, with that, Shannon can come on up and get started.
Hello, how's everybody doing? Good. It's lunchtime, right? So the important thing, if you've not yet figured out there's food in the back, there's food in the back. You should definitely take advantage of that. And I also am hoping that this room is maybe a little bit awkward to have a really interactive day, but I'd really, especially around lunch, I think it's really important to have an interactive day. So I will talk at you for a few minutes so you have a chance to get the food in you. And then after that, I really want this to be a chance for you to ask questions and for us to sort of lead the conversations in ways that are helpful for you. And so that we can talk about the things that'll make this the most meaningful time for all of you.
Turn green, and you can talk into it.
It's also very good practice for when you run for office, and you will have one of those in front of you when you're a member of the House or the Senate. So it's good skill building for you. And I also wanted to thank the funders that Professor Hodge mentioned, and I also wanted to thank the School of Social Work. This is the first time I've been back since I graduated in what I'm distressed to say it turns out to be 20 years. And that might be the thing that has made me feel oldest in the world lately. But it's been a really good experience to be back here and see the building and get to see some familiar old faces that are still here and get to meet some of you. So I want to thank the university and all of you for the welcome, and particularly Professor Hodge and Brianna for helping to organize this. So these are the things that I wanted to talk with you about, and this is sort of my general outline, and then within this, as I said, I'd love to hear questions and ideas that you have. So I wanted to talk a little bit about careers, we were just before this started talking a little bit about what we all want to be when we grow up, and I will tell you that not only did I not have any sense of that when I was a year into my MSW program, I also changed my mind on that on a pretty regular basis. So hopefully having a good sense of what are some ways that your careers can impact the political arena might be helpful for you. And then I want to talk a little bit about the definition of political social work, how power works within political social work, some of the different ways that we use political social work, and then of course, since we are all coming from the core foundation of our code of ethics, talk a little bit about how ethics work in the political process. So that's sort of the plan that we have. So the price that my dean charges for letting me sneak away in the middle of a work week is that I need to tell you that I teach at the Wirtz-Weiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University, and that we have an MSW program, and we are just launching a brand new concentration in our PhD program that focuses on policy and leadership. And if you have questions about that, you should definitely talk to me about it, or email my dean and tell her that you heard about it from me, and she'll let me go away more often. And Wirtz-Weiler is in New York City. And the reason I have In the Heights up there is anybody familiar with In the Heights or Lin-Manuel Miranda? So the creator of Hamilton. So my school is in Washington Heights. I go on a walk every day and I look for Lin-Manuel Miranda. I have yet to find him, but one of these days I will run across him walking his dog, and then I will have accomplished the last of the things on my bucket list in life. And so one of the things I thought would be important here, I'm actually going to switch. I can't really stand behind a podium very much. It makes me twitchy. So in thinking about political social work careers, it sort of naturally brought me to thinking about my political social work career and how I ended up in political social work. And the best way that I can explain that to you is how I transitioned from being a band nerd to a political nerd, which is essentially the story of my life. So I was a student at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I went to college. I went to GW and went to D.C. because that was the school that gave me enough money that I could afford to go to college. And I went in with no understanding or expectations about the political world whatsoever. But I decided that since I was in DC, I should go work for my member of Congress. And so in the fall of 1993, I took an unpaid internship for my member of Congress. And that unpaid internship turned into a paid internship only because my chief of staff realized that I didn't have access to health care. Because I grew up on Medicaid, and when I turned 18, I lost access to Medicaid in my household. And so they put me on the payroll so that I would have access to health care. So I think that's the first lesson of my story about careers, is that you need to take advantage of luck when it comes your way. But also that I think a lot of people assume political social work careers have to do with who you know and who your family knows and who you're connected to. I grew up in poverty in western South Dakota. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't connected to anybody. And I did bring a ton of luck and certainly, white privilege along with me in all of the places that I went. But taking advantage of that luck when it happened, including things like the fact that Senator Daschle's scheduler's high school football team had beat my high school football team in the state semifinals that year. And using those, what I now think of as building relationships to create opportunities, was really important part of my career. My next step to political social work was actually getting out of politics. This picture on the bottom here is the last time that the US Senate held an impeachment hearing. So this was Bill Clinton's impeachment hearing. And as we ramped up towards impeachment, I didn't want to be in Washington, D.C. anymore. It was a really unpleasant time to work in politics. It was very nasty, it was draining, and I wanted to do something else. I had this degree in psychology that I wasn't really doing anything with, and so I left. However, I have to tell you, I left not before I'd roped another family member into politics. So in this bottom picture, see where the arrow is here? That's my sister. who I convinced to apply to become a Senate page. And she actually sat on the floor of the Clinton impeachment proceedings for the entire time. And her claim to fame in life is that she gave Chief Justice Rehnquist a glass of water once during the impeachment hearings. And I will tell you, in the current political environment, I'm having a lot of flashbacks to Clinton impeachment. It's an interesting time to think back over where politics has taken us over the last 20 years. So I decided to take a break from politics and do something that I thought would be more sort of nourishing and fill my soul. And that brought me here to the University of Michigan. And on the left, this is me with my roommate when I was here at the U of M. This is our graduation in 1999. And when I left the University of Michigan, I missed politics, and I missed it much more than I thought. And I missed it because I felt like I had been working with really amazing people who were trying to make a difference in the world. And when I came here, I saw lots of other people trying to make a difference in the world, but I hadn't quite figured out where was the part that I fit. So I'd worked for a couple different nonprofits while I was here. I'd worked for a for-profit. I'd sort of tried a bunch of different things, and none of them, you know where you have that sense that like this is good and it's good work, but it's not me. And that's sort of where I kept ending up. So I went back to the Hill. I went back to Senator Daschle's office, who by this time had moved from being the junior senator from South Dakota to the majority leader of the United States Senate. Again, when you can find luck and you can grab onto it, take advantage of it. And I ended up working on Capitol Hill for a total of a decade, actually a few years before my MSW and a few years after. And this is the point that I'm gonna ask you to participate a little bit, because one of the defining moments of my career happened at this point, which was that I kept getting asked this question. Everywhere I went, people would say to me, how come you decided not to be a social worker? You spent all that money to get a degree from a great school of social work. How come you decided not to be a social worker? Who do you think asked me this question? B?
A non-social worker?
Sometimes. Social workers. The people who were most likely to ask me this question were social workers. And I got asked this question so much that I started to doubt myself, that I started to think, what's wrong with me? Why did I decide to leave social work? Why did I decide to spend all that money on a graduate degree if I was never going to use it? And the sort of place that I came to in that was two things. Number one, I don't need to let other people define what being a social worker is, right? Patrick and I are writing an article on this right now. Are you only a social worker if you have a social work degree? Are you only a social worker if you're a licensed social worker? Are you only a social worker if your job has social worker in the title? Are you only a social worker if you're doing things that the general public thinks of as social work? And when we hand that power over to other people, and sometimes we hand that power over to our government to make some of those decisions, but when we hand that power over to other people, we take it away from ourselves. And so I had to come to the place of saying to myself that being a social worker is what I say it is. And what I say it is that it's when I bring my social work values and my social work skills and my social work and particularly social justice perspective to the work that I do, then I'm doing social work, whether or not the word social worker is in the title of my job. And I'm going to give you my absolute favorite example of this, which is a good friend of mine and a former student named Sally Tamerkin. And among other things, she co-hosts a really amazing podcast called The Struggle Bus that I highly recommend. It's sort of like an advice column. But she spends most of her time in her day job at Self magazine, and she's an editor at Self. And at Self, she writes and produces and makes sure that the work that they put out around women's health and beauty is body positive, socially just writing. And an example of that is they just put out a set of free stock photos that are people of color getting immunizations and adults getting immunizations and people who are happy getting immunizations, so that when people write stories about vaccines and they pull a stock photo to put in it, it's not going to be a white baby crying because he's getting vaccinated. It's going to be the whole picture of what people getting vaccinated look like. Does her job title say social worker? No. Is she doing political social work? Yes. Because the work that she's doing is going to influence policymakers, it's going to influence public thought, it's going to influence a lot of different people. So that's my first takeaway for today, that you get to decide what being a social worker is, and the career that you choose to do after you leave the University of Michigan, it doesn't matter if it's got social work in the name or not. If you're bringing your education here and your values and the social work perspective to that job, then you're doing it, you're a social worker in that position. And I have lots of other examples, and I'm sure faculty do as well, of other people in those situations. All right, this is the next time that you get to answer some questions. You probably know that I have an answer to this question, right? But I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think are the pros and cons of social workers being involved in politics? Yes.
So one important thing I think is that social workers tend to have much more of an asset mindset than a lot of other individuals in professions, which I think in our political realm right now would be really needed, because I feel like we're always so focused on what everyone's lacking and not what resources we can leverage.
Right, great. So more assets and strengths based and less of a deficit focus. Awesome. What else? Yes.
I'm also at the School of Public Policy and Social Work, and there I feel like a lot of people see politics and policy as a game of like, how do I manipulate a system to get whatever agenda I have ahead? And I think the view of social work kind of roots it much more in kind of ethics and social values that should be promoted instead of just maneuvering through the system.
Mm-hmm. Right, and sort of seeing the bigger purpose to it rather than just winning a game. And I've certainly worked on my share of campaigns where the goal is to win a game, whether or not our candidate is the best candidate or your candidate is the best candidate. So that definitely happens. Other thoughts about pros and cons?
Sorry, I got another one.
Okay.
I've just observed. Oh, so I'll let someone else talk.
No, you're good. You're good.
Well, I've just noticed that, like, particularly in the Democratic primary race, there's been such a much stronger focus on grassroots approaches to getting supporters, at least with the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warrens, Andrew Yang's of the world. And I feel like that's kind of the direction, at least one of our political parties is going in. And I think social workers can be of particular use in community organization. If I'm a macro social work student myself, so I'm in the community organization realm.
Okay. Yeah, CO techniques are huge in the political arena. Agreed. Yes.
I think a possible difficulty being a social worker in politics is that we're trained to be pretty empathetic. And so I think we run the risk of making this work really personal and getting too involved in the weeds or putting ourselves personally too much into the issues that it might impact whether or not we're able to maintain our presence in this work.
I think that's a really good point. And it's interesting, one of the reasons that I avoided direct practice is that I felt like in direct practice I had a really hard time having a boundary between me and sort of taking work home. But when you're sitting in a room full of community members who are being affected by a problem, then I still have not figured out a way to not take that home with me, for sure. Anybody else? I know, you just ate lunch.
And kind of to your point, the politics isn't really the first thing people think about when they think of a social worker. And so I think that can lean to folks kind of underestimating or undervaluing our degrees or our expertise, and they might think it's not well placed. So it might be more difficult, or in my experience, it's been more difficult to maintain a seat at the table or even to get one because folks don't think that your credentials are relevant to politics.
Yeah. And I would say, so I applied for a job once it was a candidate's office that I'd worked for that candidate. And I went in, and the chief of staff, who I'd known for a really long time, looked at my resume and said, well, now that I see your resume and I see that you have a social work degree, are you applying to be a caseworker? And I said, no, I applied to be your deputy chief of staff, dude. Like, you know that, because you know that. But seeing social work on my resume, it changed his opinion of me. And so I think as social workers, as we go into any non-traditional place, we have to be prepared to tell our story. We have to be prepared both in a cover letter, in an interview, but just in our interactions and our networking with people, we have to be prepared to explain what it is that social work brings to the table. Here's the great thing, though. If we can get to a place where there is a mass of social workers who are politically involved in the places that we live, we can actually stop having to do that because it'll start to be seen as the expectation. One of the things that brought me to Connecticut was the Humphreys Institute, which has been training social workers to run for office for 24 years now. There's 7 social workers in the state legislature in Connecticut. They have a social work caucus. And we have social workers in the Secretary of State's office. We have social workers in all of the nonpartisan legislative offices. And I have a friend who works at the Capitol that I see occasionally who said to me once, so do social workers do anything other than this? And I was like, yes, goal accomplished. So if we can get to the point that we do have more social workers in these positions, then there will be less of a need that we have to tell that story to people. But for now, we have to tell that story to people. The good thing about that, though, is it's an interesting story, right? It's not the same story that they're used to hearing of the people who, we don't meet the standard profile of the people who usually walk in the door for most of these jobs, and that can be something that's really an advantage. On the slide behind me, I have sort of like 2 of the standard historical narratives within the profession of social work about whether or not we as a profession should be involved in politics. I will make a pop culture reference anytime I can. I had to be talked out of making a Frozen 2 reference later on in this speech, but I will stick with Hamilton. And so we sort of have the Aaron Burr side of this, that we should talk less, smile more, right? We should be nonpartisan. We should really be there to support other people. As you've probably figured out by now, that's not the position I take. And on the other side here, we have the sort of the Alexander Hamilton side of this, which is if you stand for nothing, then what will you fall for? Keeping in mind that I think many other people argue that social work is a political profession in that everything that we do is affected by the political process. We can sure choose not to get involved in that process, but we cannot choose not to be affected by it. That's not a choice we ever get to make. And so if we want to make sure that our lawmakers understand how the policies that they're making are affecting the people that we're working with, then we have to make a choice about whether or not we're going to work to make sure those lawmakers are informed, or we're going to say this isn't really my business and keep working under the systems that we're continuing to work under. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the ethical challenges for social workers as we deal with this. But I think that's a really important part of thinking about like how and where we fit into this process. So as I said, I came to the Humphreys Institute in 2004, and I want to take just a minute to say Nancy Humphreys, who is the founder of the Humphreys Institute and has a Michigan connection, although I'm sorry to say not to the University of Michigan. She was the former director of the Michigan State University School of Social Work. She passed away a year and a week ago. And this is in the middle, in 2004, this is my very first campaign school with her. When I had just moved to Connecticut, I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. And on the left is her, just about right before her death, with a group of the people that she'd mentored and supported throughout her career. And on the other side is her with my daughter, which I know is 6 years ago, because she's about that little baby's about to turn 7. And Nancy Humphreys was able to convince me that I was not the only social worker who cared about politics, and help me to frame the way that I talk about it and think about it in a way that I could sort of have those conversations with students and with other people. And for me, the Humphreys Institute sort of helped me pull together all of those different parts of what I'd been doing. But it really also was the part that I realized that if you want to do social work in hard ways, which I think most of us really do, you have to figure out who your people are. You have to find your community and find the other people who have the same goals that you are or similar goals, and the people who are going to be there to support you when you do it. Without the community at the Humphreys Institute, I don't know that I would have continued to think of myself as a political social worker, because I was still really struggling with that idea of not being like the other people around me. And so that's my second takeaway, is whatever it is that you decide to do with your social work degree, is figuring out a way to find a community of people who are going to support you, and that is really important. And so we can talk about a lot of different things today, but fundamentally the way that I live political social work today in my job at Yeshiva and other places is trying to figure out how to get more social workers involved in the political process, try to figure out how we can make policy outcomes better, primarily around things like salary disparities, healthcare, and gender bias. And then I try to make sure in every article I write or every study that I do, I figure out a way that we can bring it back into social work education or make social work education a better place so that we're having some of these conversations in social work education. So this is the part where I'm going to tell you the definition of political social work. But this is not a definition that came down, like, it didn't come down on a tablet from the mountaintop, right? Like, this is the definition because Suzanne Pritzker and I said it was the definition, and we wrote it in a book. So I'm going to tell you what we think the definition is, and then I'm going to ask you what you think is missing from this definition, or what you think we could add to this definition to make it a better one. Is that too much thinking for right after lunch? We can do it, right? Yes, we can do hard things. We can think about this after lunch. All right, so my definition is that political social work is social work practice that explicitly attends to power dynamics in policymaking and political mechanisms for eliciting social change. It's my own definition. You'd think I could read it without a misstep. And we'll talk about some of this later. The 5 domains that we've included in here are expanding political participation, influencing policy agendas, working on campaigns or in electoral offices, and holding elected offices. All right, so that's our starting definition for today. What would make this a better definition? What could we add or take away that would make it more inclusive or make it fit the areas of social work that you're interested in, or just sort of change it up a little bit? Yes.
So, okay. So one thing that I think is really present in social work is the element of like community empowerment and uplifting community voices. And I wonder if that community organizing piece and elevating voice could be an element of that.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think one of the things as we talk about political participation, even like in the everyday world when I'm thinking about voting, the ways that social work has often approached voting is to be like, what can we do to convince people to vote? And I think we're starting to change that a little bit and to starting to think around like, what can we do to talk to communities about why they do or don't vote? And thinking a little bit more about it rather than being like, this is this thing that you should do, which if you think of it is not a really social worky way to approach it, right? Is to think a little bit differently about there are some really good reasons that many groups of people in our country choose not to vote or are not able to vote, and thinking about that. So I think that gets a little bit to what you're talking about in terms of giving, not about me giving power or pushing power somewhere, but me like sort of allowing a different group of people to sort of me stepping away and allowing them to access their power. Okay, so right. Okay, so influencing the policy agenda as well as voting. Okay, great, good, thank you. What else?
Yeah, I wonder where you think like research and theory would go into this when it comes to policies and like politics. What kind of, if you would think that would be kind of a different domain, or to me that's just something that underlies all 5 of these domains that is often overlooked as like the influence that it can have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the way that we conceptualized it, but I'm not sure that this is the best way, is that although we sort of give a nod at the end that this includes research and theory, but I think our idea was that it should be woven throughout. Here's the challenge, though. If you actually look at the social work research, a lot of the research that we pull for all of these domains is actually not social work research, right? We pull from public policy, we pull from political science. We're pulling a lot of research from other places, which, as with all the other ways we do this in social work, has some pros and cons, right? Because it gives us access to a wider variety of research than we would have if it was just us. But it's also then, it's not, as somebody mentioned before, then it's not really always asset-focused or strengths-focused research. And it's not necessarily using the methodology or looking at the populations that we would look at. So I think it's a conversation we have to keep having. Research needs to be embedded in this more, but then we have to then figure out as a profession where we can take the responsibility. There's a really good amount of social work research around advocacy and influencing policy agendas. The bulk of the work on holding office, working on campaigns and voting is pretty recent, with the exception of Richard Cloward. And so there's a lot of opportunity in those areas for social work to step up in terms of research. And all of the theories that we use right now, all of them are from other domains. All of them are not social work theories. I would love to change that, but right now that's where we are. So I think that's a good point. Thank you. Yes. Yes, Professor?
What do you think about a sixth domain of engaging with political parties?
Oh.
Maybe like addition to.
Engaging with parties, you mean separate from, like not as you would engage with parties in the middle of each of these, but as a separate domain.
Right, like running a party or being engaged in the running of a party.
I don't know what I think about that.
Second edition.
What do you guys think?
I think it's a thing.
What do you think? I think she's arguing with him, so that's a good start.
I was clarifying because I was like, wouldn't that be just working on a campaign or working on a team like, and then Justin said.
Well, so the work that you might do with a political party is very different than the work that you would do running a campaign.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good point. And I think, so I think most of my political career, the work that happened at the party level was sort of out of sight of the general public. And I think in 2016, and I actually think we have the Democratic Party to thank for both of these things, between the 2016 process of assigning delegates to candidates that sort of felt like there was a predetermined candidate that the party was going to go for no matter what. And so it made, you know, whether you were a Sanders fan or another person fan, like people felt disenfranchised from the system. And then Iowa, I think has sort of, the Iowa caucus process has sort of helped people understand what parties do in a lot of ways that I think wasn't available to, if you were really in the political system, you were comfortable with it, but maybe not if you were in the general public. I think that's a good question, because I think there's also a view of a lot of people right now that the political parties are not a system that they want to work within, and that they're not the place that you're going to make social change happen. So I think there's an interesting sort of dynamic to be had there. So I think there's an article in this, Justin. We should talk. Other thoughts? Patrick.
Yeah. I think a lot of the conversation in social work and where I see a lot of overlap with politics is thinking about structures and systems, particularly around oppression. And so I think when social workers are interested or sort of feel their passion is around confronting structures and systems, like thinking about that as political social work as well, that is political work when you're challenging sort of systems of oppression.
Yeah.
And how we, particularly I think, one way it overlaps with politics is how we sort of structure our institutions, either political institutions or sort of our systems of government that sort of perpetuate systems of oppression.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And let me just then, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to talk about power. So that's a really good segue into this. So you can't talk about politics without talking about power. And I think that this is a topic that a lot of social workers are uncomfortable with. So I want, and I don't want you to say it to the room, but I just want you to take a minute and think about sort of how, when you hear the term power, like how does that make you feel in terms of using and sort of wielding your own power, if that's something you feel comfortable with. And one of the interesting things for me is that when I have this conversation with my students, I often hear them say, like, I'm uncomfortable with political power, but these are the same students who in their day job are working for ACS, which is New York City's child welfare organization, right? They're wielding a tremendous amount of power in their day jobs. That power they understand and they're comfortable with. Political power makes them uncomfortable. So I think sometimes even just in different realms of our lives, we either feel like we have different levels of power or we're comfortable with different kinds of power. So this is an example of some of the different ways to think about power in the political arena that I've sort of collected over the years. And if you look at this, you'll get a sense that there are a lot of these that are sort of negative connotations of power, right? So, for example, there's only a finite amount of power available, so it's a zero-sum game. For one person to get more power, they have to take it for another. So often when I'm talking to people about expanding the right to vote, people see that as, well, if there's going to be more people showing up at the polls on election day, then my vote's going to be worth less. And that can be that can be something that makes people feel really uncomfortable. On the other hand, thinking of power as being connected to your relationship with other people is a very strengths-based kind of power, right? It can feel like, okay, that's a kind of power. If I have more power, because because I've developed a relationship with my supervisor, the client that I'm working with needs help. I can use that power from that relationship with my supervisor to help make sure that this client gets something they need. That's a kind of power that has a more positive spin to it. And I think to Patrick's point, which is a really valid one, as political social workers, there are a lot of political social workers who work for the system, right? So they're working for established candidates or political parties. There are also a lot of political social workers who are out there trying to dismantle the systems, right? And figure out what is a different way that we could run our democracy? What's a different way that we could run our systems? And from my perspective, both of those are political social work. Even though those two people may sometimes be working in opposition to one another, I think as social workers, if we are mindful as we go about what our ethics are telling us and how things like social justice and oppression and power are playing into those, we may come to different conclusions about those, but it doesn't mean that one of the kinds of work is political social work and another is not. And our history of political social workers includes people who have been very much within the system and people who have been very much, trying to tear the system down and build a different system. And both of those things are part of our legacy as social workers and as political social workers. But it can be a challenge sometimes to think about power. And so this is one of the ways that I like to think about it a lot because it's really helpful for me that as social workers, we often have power over, right? So that ACS worker that I'm talking about who gets to decide whether or not a family gets to keep their child, that's somebody who has power over another person. And the other party in that situation is generally relatively powerless, right? There's also the idea of the power too, that I have sort of the capacity to do something, right? I have the physical ability to do something, right? I have the physical ability to stand here for 2 hours, which, when my back is really bothering me, I don't have the physical power to do that, and that affects all the other parts of my life. As a political social worker, right, I have access to the right to vote, and a lot of the people that I run into in my travels don't have access to the right to vote, and so telling them that there's something wrong with them because they're not voting, which is a lot of what they hear, is not going to be particularly helpful. If you don't have access to the right to vote, it's not going to do any good. Power with is a kind of power that I think social workers often feel really comfortable with. So I think of this as power around collaboration and coming together and bringing big numbers of people together. And power within is sort of around the idea of efficacy, right? Do I feel like this is something that I can take on right now? And this picture in the middle, anybody want to guess who this is with me in this picture in the middle? That's my mom. My mom has a chronic disability and lived with me for almost a decade. And probably, this is 2012, she came out of her room and said, "Shannon, we have to do something." And I was like, what is going on? She had all this energy and all this fire, and she just when you're around somebody with a chronic disability and they just generally they don't have great color most of the time, and they don't have a lot of energy, and she had all this healthy color and energy, and I was like, what is going on? Whatever it is, let's keep doing it. And she had just watched a commercial on TV for a Senate candidate, and she came down and she said, I was watching that commercial, and Shannon, that woman is not nice. And for my mother, who is a South Dakotan through and through, not nice is literally the harshest thing she knows how to say about another human being, not nice. And she was like, but I don't know what to do. What can I do? And I was standing there, literally wearing the shirt of the other candidate in the race. And I was like, do you want to go knock on some doors? And so my mom she never knocked on a door in her life. She'd never worked on a political anything in her life. She wasn't registered to vote for big sections of her life. She didn't have a political identity. She was so energized by this candidate who was not nice that we knocked on the doors of all of our neighbors. She got to the extent that she was physically able, she got incredibly involved. That particular campaign, the candidate that we worked for, spent $10 million, which is, can we all just agree, a ridiculous amount of money. His opponent spent $50 million of her own money. Like, she wrote a check. She also had spent $50 million of her own money 2 years before that. I know. Can we just for a minute, if you had $100 million sitting around, is there maybe just anything else you would want, anything else you would want to do with it? I mean, just $100 million. We actually did the math. She by the end, she basically had spent about $8 per vote that she got. And then when she lost, just as an aside, she closed up her campaign office and didn't pay her campaign workers. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, it's super classy. Not nice, right? Thank you, Mom. Not nice. And so this was, I think, for an example of me, they theoretically had all the power in the world, right? They had so much more money. Even if you added in the outside money that was spent, they outspent the candidate that we were working for 2-1. But we had enough people who really were activated, whether it was because they thought the other person was not nice or about something specific, an issue around the campaign, that a lot of people came out and knocked on doors for free and talked with their community members. And the woman who was not nice lost by quite a bit. And for me, as a social worker, I don't think I've ever worked on a campaign where my candidate had more money than the other person. It just doesn't happen. I live in the state of Purdue Pharma. It doesn't matter what kind of campaign I'm running. There's just a lot of corporate money that's available for the people who are on the other side. But I've never felt like that in and of itself had to be the deal breaker. I think that there are a lot of ways as social workers, if we can sort of activate that power with, we have a lot of opportunities to sort of upend the power structure. Certainly, though, you can make the argument that even within this sort of David and Goliath story, you're still talking about two people who were the candidates of the major political parties and had, $10 million to spend. So we're still not talking about a baby grassroots candidate here, right? We're still talking within the bigger system. And I do really think that there are a lot of ways that we can think to try to work outside of the systems that have some real possibility for changing the power structures themselves. So in a political system, we're going to use power. You might see power used by depriving the opposition of something they want, giving the opposition something they want, for example, in exchange for an endorsement, electing somebody who supports your issues. But mostly in the political setting, we're going to be thinking about power as ways of influencing other people or the actions of other people. And probably most of you have heard the TED Talk that I'm going to talk about. And honestly, if you have not ever heard Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, you should just leave right now, go pull out your phone, watch her TED Talk. It's life-changing. It's amazing. It's called The Power of a Single Story. And she talks about a specific kind of power that we don't talk about enough in the political realm, which is this idea that there's this level of power that we cannot see because it's sort of in the air all around us, right? I have a friend who talks about racism and patriarchy and talks about the fact that we sort of breathe in the air of this racist, patriarchal, colonist air all the time everywhere we go. That's the level of power we're talking about in terms of the ideas that sort of shape our public opinion and shape our ideas about the world. And often, if you think back to the cycle of socialization, they're doing it in ways that we don't realize. We don't hear them and we don't see them. And that's really this third out of Luke's definitions or dimensions of power. That's the one that we still, I would say, as political social workers, have yet to figure out how to be effective in. I think we've made some really good progress in figuring out how to access the political system, how to try to make the political system more accessible to our clients and our communities, and even sometimes to make sure that we're getting things on the agenda that we would like to be on the agenda. I don't yet think we've gotten to the point that we can interrupt that level of power in a way that's really meaningful, and that's certainly something that I would love to think and talk more about how to do. But it's not something I'm going to answer for you, but it's I think an open question for us as a profession. All right, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about with power, and then I might make you all stand up and stretch, because I don't know what it is where you are, but it's 400 degrees where I'm standing. And if you're that hot and you just ate, it's a miracle you all are upright. But political efficacy is the last way that I want to talk about power, and this is the idea of whether or not we feel like we have power. So there's a scale of political efficacy that comes out of the American National Election Survey, and it has 4 questions on internal efficacy and 4 questions on external efficacy. And the internal ones are about sort of the power to, right? Do I feel like I have the power to do something? So these are questions like, how often do politics seem so complicated you can't understand what's going on, and how well do you understand the political issues facing our country? The external efficacy is questions like, under our form of government, the people have the final say about how the country is run, no matter who is in office. So let's just sit with these questions for a minute, right? How do you think these questions might fall on the ears of some of the people that you've worked with over your social work career? You're nodding at me and making eye contact. Always a mistake. Do you have a thought you'd be willing to share? That's okay. You got to use the mic or we can't hear you.
Sure, I'll share my thought. Thinking of the different people I've worked with throughout my career so far, I've gathered that they are oftentimes confused, or as if it doesn't really matter what they do or say, which is extremely frustrating and upsetting.
Okay. And I think so I want to say this is a scale that comes out of political science. So to the point earlier about us doing our own research, like these are not social worky questions. So what about these questions do you think sort of makes them not social worky questions? Another of them is the government cares about what people like me think or say. Does that help? So here's the challenge. We can't take these as an overall scale of efficacy in terms of like what somebody's idea of the system is. Because here's the problem, right? The government does care about what I say, right? Because I am a white middle-class woman who lives in a small town where everybody knows me. The answer to that question is true. My government does care about what I say because I show up and I'm present and I talk to them in ways that they're happy to listen to me. My friend who lives in New Haven next door to me, who lives in a town where it's really impossible to get access to the ballot, where on election day the line to register to vote is so long that people who've literally been in line all day don't get to vote, where their elected officials are constantly battling a lack of resources and a lack of funding from the state and an inequity around things like their education system, right? So my friend down the road in New Haven, she would answer to this, people do not care what people like I think or say, and she would also be correct. There is not one correct answer to this, right? I think the designers of this study out of political science thought, well, of course the answer to this is that the government does care what people like you think, right? Like they thought that was a true statement, not thinking about the positionality that people bring to their political interactions. And for me, that's a real challenge in doing this work because if I give this scale to my students and they say the government doesn't care about me, my job is not to convince them that the government cares about them because that might not be the case, right? My job is not to convince them that they're wrong. Sort of to the point about community empowerment earlier. My job might be to figure out how we can elect a government that will care about what they think, but my job shouldn't be to convince them that they're wrong. And that's, I think, where you often see the scale used in political science in a way that makes me feel like sort of unsocial worky, in a way that I think we need to do it a little bit differently. This is one of my favorite cartoons. This comes out of the Houston Chronicle. And this, I think, gets to this idea of when we talk about voting, which is our next topic, individual people will frequently say, my vote doesn't matter. And they're not wrong. It literally does not matter who I vote for president this year. Like, it absolutely doesn't. I live in a state that's going to go to one political party by a substantial margin. So if you tell me it doesn't matter who I vote for president, and then we can also get into the Electoral College, I don't know if we have that kind of time. It's true, but it absolutely does matter who I vote for in my town elections. We recounted our town election this year, and somebody lost by 6 votes. Like, there are 6 people who live in my house. I mean, they're not all eligible to vote unless they're letting 4-year-olds vote now. In that election, it absolutely did matter. It absolutely does matter if I can get 100 social workers to register their clients to vote and get them to the polls. That's going to matter, right? So political efficacy, I think, for us as social workers has to be about community efficacy and collective efficacy, not about me as an individual and my vote, because my individual vote, although you all are in Michigan, you are more likely to have your vote matter in these things than mine do. Maybe I should move. Professor Hodge keeps trying to convince me. But unless you live in, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Florida, like, does your individual vote make a difference in the presidential race? Often not. Does that mean you shouldn't vote, or does that mean your vote doesn't matter in other things? No, but we need to think about efficacy a little bit differently. All right. So out of these domains of political social work, which we've established are not all encompassing, what are you most interested in talking about? Because I could literally talk about all of these things for days. Justin knows. He has to put up with me quite a bit. What would be helpful? What would be useful for you in thinking about your career or your internship or your current classes or a question that you have about the political process? I'm a social worker and a professor. I can handle an awkward silence.
Hi, I'm Simi. I guess my biggest thing that I'm interested in is how to hold elected officials accountable for essentially not having the needs of the community that they serve in mind. That's always at the forefront of my mind.
Okay, so how to hold elected officials accountable. Awesome. What else? I'm writing a list. Please don't make it a one-item list. Okay, engaging communities and influencing policy agendas. Anything else? I'm gonna give them money later. Engaging with campaigns. Okay, awesome. What? Yeah, one of my former students said to me, it's not that you're not funny, it's that you laugh at your jokes before we do. Weirdly, she's still a friend of mine. Weirdly. All right, so let's start with number 1, and I think this is gonna be part of your conversation about holding elected officials accountable. Because I think a big part of what we can do to hold elected officials accountable, I'm gonna move around and see if it's cooler in other places. It is really, really hot back here. I was dressing for Michigan, not Hawaii. I do. I can wander. I know. I can wander. All right. So I would argue that one of the biggest ways to hold elected officials accountable is to change who the electorate is made up of, right? So if you talk to your average elected official and you say to them, all right, tomorrow you can either go to the senior center and talk to the seniors, or you can go to the homeless shelter and talk to the people there. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to the senior center. Why are they going to go to the senior center? Because people over the age of 55 in this country vote amazingly well, right? So part of our challenge is figuring out how we can change the electorate, because many elected officials are in it for good reasons. Yeah. Many elected officials are in it because they want to keep their job, right? They want to get elected the next time around. And even if they're in it for good reasons, they still want to keep their job. So how do we do that? How do we change who the electorate is so that we can make an elected official just as interested in talking to the people at the homeless shelter or a group of college students as they are in talking to the people at the senior center? So some of that is about this, right? Engaging communities in voting. A big part of the work that I'm working on right now is changing access for people with felony convictions to get access to the polls. So among the other things that made the Iowa caucuses a debacle was the fact that I would argue, and I argue this as a South Dakotan who has family from Iowa who probably all can't stand me at the moment, why is Iowa such a huge part of the decision about who our presidential candidates will be? Not only is Iowa 90% white, Iowa is the only state left, the only one, that permanently disenfranchises everyone with a felony conviction. Meaning if you are one of the 10% of people in Iowa who are not white and you're one of the smaller group of that who are African American, you are significantly likely not to have access to the polls. So we have now taken this really white state and made sure that the electorate will be even whiter. And then we say to them, here, you get the first bite at deciding who the next Democratic candidate for president of the United States will be. That is baloney, right? The look on your face is exactly how I've been feeling. Good.
On that topic, in Florida, a federal appeals court just ruled in favor of ex-felons that it's unconstitutional for the state to create a law that bars people based off of like their wealth. What is it? They said specifically a class of felons based on their wealth. So
awesome. And so
the
history of this, right, is that in Florida, so Florida used to be one of the other states that disenfranchised you for life after a felony conviction. They passed a constitutional amendment to change that, and then the state said, okay, you can vote if and only if you've paid all your fines. Is that a poll tax? No. Oh, also, do we have a system in place to make sure you've paid all your fines? No. You've got to figure that out. So a group of people brought a number of lawsuits, and I actually hadn't heard that result, so that's very exciting. Excellent. And I think Florida is a good example of this. If all of the people with felony convictions in Florida access their right to vote in the 2020 elections, it could change the landscape, the electoral landscape in Florida. And given the ridiculous electoral college and the amount of influence Florida has, that could change who's the next president of the United States. If there are pathways to make sure they can vote, and if those pathways are enforced. The first election I ever worked was on a Lakota reservation in South Dakota, and they did some voter suppression tactics there that are similar to things they've done in Florida in the past, which are things like posting police cars or vehicles that look like police cars outside of polling places. Having somebody who stands there and when you get out of your car, just taking a picture of your license plate, not saying anything to you, just taking a picture of your license plate. And people will get in their car and leave, right? That's scary, that's intimidating. It's designed to be scary and intimidating, and people will leave. Checkpoints in Florida, right, where they stop people who are coming near a polling place. I mean, the polling place in my hometown, it's attached to the prison. The polling place I used to go to in my hometown was in our county courthouse, which was attached to the prison. Right? There are structural things that make people either with felony convictions unable to vote or make them really, really uncomfortable voting, right? If we can change those things and we can change the electorate, I think we can absolutely start to hold people accountable in a different way. And one of the things I'm arguing, the profession of social work has no official statement about felon disenfranchisement at all. We do have lots of official statements about mass incarceration, which is certainly important and related. But that's one of the things I'm arguing about is as a profession, we shouldn't just be trying to make sure that people who are eligible to vote get to vote. We should be pushing this bigger conversation about making it easier for people to vote. I talked with somebody from the Bronx Public Defender's Office last week, and she told me that every person she talks with, she tries to make sure that if they're eligible to vote, they can vote. But it depends on what their charge is, right? It depends on what their charge is. It depends on where they're from. Because just because they're in a facility in New York doesn't mean that they're a New Yorker. And then if they're from a different state, she's got to go research what the laws are in that state because the laws around criminal involvement and voting are different in every single state. And so she spends hours just trying to figure out for each of these people she works with, are they eligible to vote? If so, can she get them access to an absentee ballot? Will the prison officials let it in? Will they let their ballot out when they're done with it? I mean, hours. And this isn't like, she just does this on the side because she thinks it's important. Her full-time job is to help them with their legal concerns, right? So this idea around voting is bigger than just sort of this public idea of like convince people that they should vote, right? Like that's just it's important. I do a lot of it, but it's a small part of this bigger thing we do. Sticking with this idea around the criminal justice system, people who have come out of the criminal justice system often don't know that they can have their right to vote back because it's different in every state. I have a family member who has a felony conviction from when I was young, and I guess we were talking about what I do for work one day, and I said something about voting, and he was like, oh yeah, I can't vote. And I said, you finished your probation when I was a kid. You are absolutely eligible to vote in this state. And he had no idea. He had been not voting for like 30 years because nobody had said to him, now you're eligible to vote again. It just wasn't a part of the conversation. And not only do I think it has benefits for changing the electorate and holding people accountable, we also know that when people who come out of the criminal justice system vote, that they're less likely to recidivate. They feel more a part of their community. It can be a tool in the toolkit of helping them to feel like they're a part of their community again and a part of a bigger picture. So it's got a lot of benefits, I think, for us in our social justice goals, but it also has a lot of goals for individual. All right, I think that was a little bit of a tangent because I was talking about Iowa and then you talked about Florida. And there I am on felony voting. So there's a lot of different people in social work who are doing different versions of this. So this picture in the middle is Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven, who are watching Bill Clinton sign the motor voter law. So in Michigan, I presume, when you go to get your driver's license, they ask you if you want to register to vote. Good, excellent. They're supposed to, it's federal law. There are many states now that are starting to institute automatic voter registration. Do you have that here? So in states with automatic voter registration, they register you to vote without asking you. Like if you're eligible, they register you, and then you don't have to vote, but we at least get rid of that first barrier. And weirdly, in North Dakota, you don't have to register to vote. I don't know why. That's the only state in the US without voter registration. But also the rest of the world doesn't have voter registration. Like it's not a thing that everybody does. It's this thing that we do. Why? Why do we have to register to vote in the US? What? Go ahead. It's a control thing. Absolutely. We might as well make it as hard as possible for people to vote so that we can make sure that the right people are voting, right? So our founders, right, they said, who are the right people? White landowners over the age of 21. We've changed many features of that over the years, but we haven't changed this idea that you still hear talked about in the media all the time, right? That people, if you don't know enough, you shouldn't go vote, right? People who aren't educated shouldn't go vote. Well, there's all sorts of race and class like embedded in that idea of who knows enough to vote and who should be able to navigate these systems. So the Humphreys Institute, the Voting and Social Work Initiative, a lot of people are doing some of that work around expanding the electorate. But we also have, on the left-hand side down here, is Addie Sandler, who's a professor at a school in New York. And her dissertation was a survey of social worker or students at community colleges who got public assistance. And she talked with them about voting. And she found something that I thought was really, it's sort of obvious to anybody who's in it, but it hadn't been talked about in the literature before, that she sort of found, there were people in her sample who they voted all the time. They knew how to vote, they knew where their polling place was, they kept, abreast, they were always gonna vote no matter what. That's the group of people that every political party I've ever worked for would wanna have access to. But these are students in poverty, no political party had ever talked to them. Despite the fact that they had amazing voting records, no political party had ever talked to them. There's another group of people who they were registered, they might vote, they might not, depending on the barriers. That's the group of people we often think of. Oh, we gotta make sure they have childcare. We gotta make sure they have a ride to the polls, right? There was another group of people who were like, what? Elections? My life is on fire around me, this isn't a thing I'm thinking about. But there was this other group that she talked to who knew exactly when election day, who knew everything that was going on in the process. One that I'll never forget was a guy who every election day would take his grandmother to the polls and stand outside while she went in and voted and then take her home. And so Addie said, and why don't you vote? And he was like, this system does not, can I swear in here? This system doesn't give a shit about me. why would I participate in it? And that's, I think, when we come at this from a perspective of, oh, if we only give people enough information, they'll vote, those are the people that we're missing out on. And those are the people we're just making them matter, right? Those are the people that as social workers, we're gonna run into. And I think those are genuine conversations to have, right? Because my job, I think, when I talk to that person, is not necessarily to get him to go to the polls. My job is to figure out, okay, what's going on with the system? And are there social workers who are fixing that system and dealing with that problem? Because if he feels like that system will respond to him, then we can go back and have the conversation about voting. But we need to fix the problem first. Like him voting, him choosing not to vote, that's not the problem. That's a symptom of the problem. That's not the problem. And I think in particular, you know, in the cities in Connecticut, we have, you know, there's a history of like outside money coming into the cities that bring corruption. We actually have right now, mayors of two of the largest cities in Connecticut who have actually served corruption charges. In fact, one who would not be eligible to vote in Iowa and is now mayor of the largest city in Connecticut. And the other interesting thing is that these are white men who are mayors of majority minority cities in Connecticut who are sort of in this corrupt political stew. Well, looking at that and thinking my vote is not a good thing to do is a really, really logical conclusion, I think, to that situation. And I think solving that isn't about getting that dude to go vote. It's about dealing with the bigger picture. And again, that's not, like if I had the solution to corruption in politics, you wouldn't be able to afford me coming here.
Yeah, the conversation just makes me kind of think about like the satellite caucuses that happened in Iowa and how a lot of people that showed up to those were historically disenfranchised groups, and how Bernie Sanders' campaign like purposely targeted satellite caucuses, and to have those caucuses at different times in different locations. I think one of them was held at a mosque, and how just the demographics of the people that went to those at the end, that started to really matter when they were, I mean, it was a whole mess, but at least when they were calculating the few days after the caucus, that showed that that particular group of people mattered a lot, and just how his campaign was engaging with this kind of different way of caucusing, and trying to engage these different communities in the process, I think was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's also the other issue with the Iowa caucuses, other than the demographics of Iowa, are that caucuses are incredibly disenfranchising to most of the people we care about, right? Like, I wouldn't be able to go to a caucus. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. What am I supposed to do with them for 3 hours while people wander around and like try to use this app that doesn't work? Like, it's not going to happen. You know, caucuses are disenfranchising to people who work second shift, to people with physical ability limited. I mean, they're disenfranchising to most of the people that we care about. Anyway, I honestly think my sister was actually at the Iowa caucuses as an observer, and I texted her that night and I said, I think you've seen the last Iowa caucus. Like, if there's another Iowa caucus, I will. I mean, I am frequently wrong about these things. Should I not say that? I'm frequently wrong about these things, but I will eat my hat if there's another Iowa caucus. All right, other questions about voting that we haven't talked about? I do think it's a good thing to do for many people. And I think there's a lot of groups that we work with as social workers who don't have access to the polls that we could help with that process, whether that is, you know, working with people with, you know, differing abilities. I had a student who was who lived in, I had a student in New York who lived in Harlem and took her dad to the polls, and he'd voted his whole life. He had a vision impairment later in life. And she took him to the polls, and they said to him, and I quote, "Sorry, we can't help people like you," and sent him on his way. So, A, illegal. B, humiliating to this guy who had been a part of his community for a long time and been a voter and believed really strongly in the system. Like, absolutely humiliating to him, right? Those kinds of barriers, when we find them, like we can attack those, and we can make those public, and we can help make those better. And his daughter, who was my student, will fight for voting rights for the rest of her life, because her goal is to make sure that nobody else gets treated the way that her dad did that day, because it was an awful experience for him. Other thoughts about voting? Okay. I did feel like it was important to mention that there's several things going on here about voting. So there's an event coming up about suffrage over here. And then the Michigan NASW has a voting rights information on their website with lots of local resources. And then I don't know, I'd heard from a couple people about this turn up, turn out. I don't know, Bree, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so Turn Up, Turn Out is an organization here at the University of Michigan. It's having to do with the Big Ten Voter Challenge. So we compete with other Big Ten schools, but here at the university, we can like compete with other the School of Nursing, School of Public Policy, who registers the most students. So that is coming up for the November election. Yeah.
And then the other thing that's up here, Voting as Social Work is a national organization that has resources if you wanted to, say, do voter registration or voter engagement in your field placement. There's a ton of resources on their website that can be really helpful for that.
So you're going to see a lot of advertising about getting registered to vote for the 2020 election. So last time in 2018, we registered the largest number of students across the university, but not the highest percentage. So we're trying to win on both the percentage and the number this time. Ford was up there too. It was us, Ford, and information. Information had the highest percentage, but we're trying to win just across the board this time.
Because it's not a game, but you might as well make it a game to make it fun. And when we talk about influencing policy agendas, and this is also, I think, connects with the idea of holding policymakers accountable, is figuring out how to get on the agenda and how to get on their radar. Do you all know Dorothy Height? Yeah, yes? No? Maybe? All right, I'm going to talk about her anyway. So Dorothy Height, maybe 10 years ago, I was in DC helping to organize a group of social work students, sort of the precursor to Social Work Day on the Hill. And one of the organizers knew Dorothy Height and brought her in to talk to us. And I had not learned about her, which is maybe something we should add into the University of Michigan School Social Work curriculum. I wasn't familiar with her at all. And they wheeled her into this room, and I'm in a room of 300, mostly BSW students, who up to this point in the day have not stopped talking once. And they wheeled in Dorothy Height, who's in a wheelchair. She had she always had amazing hats. She had a really amazing tall hat on. So from where I was, I could see her hat and I couldn't see her. And they handed her a mic, and I legitimately thought this is gonna be a disaster, right? And she started talking, and every student in the room shut up, and you could hear a pin drop. And she started with, in 1929, when I graduated from high school, I was a woman. I could be a teacher or I could be a social worker. I decided to be a social worker. And the rest of the time, the whole room is silent. And she talked about her experience growing up as a social worker in New York. She eventually met Mary McLeod Bethune, and Bethune was her mentor. And she was one of the women who was a key member of the civil rights movement. And she ended up running a couple of national organizations for Black women. And this picture here, she was the only woman on the dais during Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And they actually didn't want her up there. They said, we don't need any women up here. You're represented well enough by the men that are here. You don't need to be here. And she, in her book and in her talks, sort of recounts a lot of those experiences of people saying to her, essentially, you can fight for women's rights or you can fight for civil rights, but sort of a lack of understanding at the time that intersection mattered was really apparent to her when she would try to have a voice in a lot of the movement. And so this picture here, that's also got Whitney Young in it. So if you're familiar with National NASW, one of the Social Work Reinvestment Act they've been supporting for a number of years is the Dorothy Height Whitney Young Reinvestment Act, and it's named after the two of them. And this is a meeting with civil rights leaders and Bobby Kennedy. Dorothy Height, and became sort of one of the core people that president after president after president used as a guide and a sort of a sage and a source of advice. And one of the things that she was able to do was to make sure that whether she was in a room where she was talking about women's issues, she would bring in civil rights issues. And if she was in a room where they were talking about civil rights issues, she would bring in women's issues. And so she, for me, is just such a phenomenal example of that, using that intersectionality and bringing that into everything that she does. One of the things she does that most social workers don't know is if you've taken a research class, which you probably have to do, sorry, you probably have talked about the Belmont Report, which is what a lot of our sort of ethics that we have to go through as researchers is based on. Dorothy Height sat on the committee that wrote the Belmont Report, and she sat on that committee primarily from a perspective of making sure that people in poverty who were research subjects had some rights in that process. And she brought in examples of people that she knew who didn't want to participate in research because they knew that they weren't going to be treated well, and sort of helped to make sure that those people's voices were part of that process. And I think that's a great example because, I mean, the Belmont Report wasn't a law that was passed by Congress, but it was an official piece of work that influences the work that I do as a researcher in 2020. It's a hugely influential thing. And so she's a great example of one of the ways that social workers can do this, can influence agendas. And also she's amazing. So I think in terms of, I don't know, advocacy tends to be part of a lot of schools' agendas. So I don't know how much more it's helpful to talk about advocacy. Do you feel like you've gotten towards what you needed around holding elected officials accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the more we talk about it and the more we talk about voting, the more I think about like campaign finance reform and getting money out of politics. But that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I did get what I needed out of it. So thanks.
And I think there's campaign finance reform has not been something that's been on the radar of a lot of social workers, but I absolutely agree that it should be. I live in one of the 3 states that has public financing for state elections. So in Connecticut, you have to raise a certain amount of sort of low dollar amounts from your community, and then you essentially get a government grant to run your campaign. It's not popular in a lot of places because people don't necessarily want government money going to campaigns, but what it means is that we've drastically reduced spending on elections, and it also has meant that we've drastically reduced the number of long-term incumbents who stay in office. We don't have term limits, but the year that they launched campaign finance reform, or our public election system, we elected 5 people under the age of 30 to the state legislature because they could compete for the first time, including a 25-year-old social worker in Newtown, Connecticut, who then was the state rep in Newtown when the Sandy Hook shooting happened. He would not have been in that position if it wasn't for the campaign finance rules, because the woman in that position before him was a 14-year incumbent who could raise all the money she needed with a couple of phone calls, and he never would have been able to do that. And so we can see a lot of benefits to, at the state level, campaign finance. Federal campaign finance right now is a dumpster fire. And that's going to involve some pretty sustained change, but there's lots of ways that we can change it on the state level that aren't as affected by the federal rulings that I think social workers should be talking more about. But I would agree with you. Money in politics it's the elephant in the room, for sure. Other thoughts about advocacy? Can I make everybody stand up and stretch? Okay, stand up and stretch. Is it hot over here? Oh, it really is. Is anybody cold? If you're cold, come hang out up front with me. Yeah. Well, I know. He told me to stay right here because there's a video on me, apparently. Hi. I don't know where it is. Hi. Whoever you are. And there's, I think, still some more food in the back. So if you're hungry, if you're hungry, go get more food. But save a little bit for me. Whatever. All right, who said they wanted to talk about running for office? Ooh, yes.
I just wanted to put in a plug, as we're talking about elections, to also talk about the census and completing the census, which we can advocate for. We can inform people. There are, for example, in Ann Arbor, a lot of students think, oh, my parents are going to do that. And in fact, if you're living off campus, which most of our undergrads do, your parents are not going to do that. You need to count yourself. So, and there are a lot of reasons why, of course, we want people to complete the census. And it's part of the whole political process. So that's another area I think we can engage in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, at the Humphreys Institute, they've been putting together some some census materials. If you wanted to go to your internship or your job and talk to people about filling out the census, there's a lot of really good resources out there for that. And I think one of the a lot of the barriers we face with the census are similar to the barriers about voting. Although there is not a citizenship question on the census, the fact that there was supposed to be one and it made national news and people talked about it, I would argue has probably achieved its desired goal, which is to make a lot of communities not want to fill out the census. And so, sort of similar to voting, like when I talk to people and they say, I'm afraid of what the government's going to do with my info, I feel really strongly that my job as a social worker is not to say, like, it's fine, trust the government, it'll be fine, right? Like, I'm not going to say that. I can certainly share what I know around how the information is used and how it might benefit them, but I also feel really strongly that at that point, then it's up to that person to make the best decision for them and their family. So a question I get about this a lot is, like, if I'm documented but I live in a mixed status family where there's other people in my household who are undocumented, is there a way that me filling out the census can be used against my family? And I can tell you the official answer to that is that it's not supposed to be, and that the people who work for there's supposed to be a firewall between the census and the rest of the federal government. Can I tell you 100% for sure? In a week where we know that the practitioners who work for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that their notes of therapy sessions with unaccompanied migrant kids are now being used against those unaccompanied minor kids in their legal cases. Like, in that environment, can I tell you for sure that filling out the census won't be bad for your family? I can't tell you that. I can tell you why it's a benefit, and I can tell you how we think it might benefit your community as a whole. And then we have to trust people to make the best decisions for themselves and their families. And for the vast majority of us who are not in that situation where it's not a potential danger to our families, I think we have even a bigger obligation to fill it out and make sure that our communities are counted as best as possible. And then sort of the macro part of this, why do we do it this way? Why do we count every single person in the country instead of using, I don't know, statistics? We don't have to. It doesn't say in the Constitution that we have to physically count every person. It says in the Constitution we have to count every person. It doesn't say we have to do it this way. And so I think there's even like that other policy level to it. But this way of counting, without intervention of people who care about social justice, will undercount communities of color, will undercount poor communities, will undercount communities with large amounts of homelessness. It will undercount many of the communities that we care about. So thank you for that plug. I can also talk about the census all day. Although the city of New York keeps refusing to give me money to do it, so I guess I'll just do it for free. All right, so let's talk about engaging with campaigns. Anybody here ever worked on a campaign? I'm not even going to look over there. I know there's a yes over there. What kind of campaign did you work on? The governor's? Okay. Awesome. Anybody else? Okay, excellent. Yes, I do know of a campaign that you might want to think about working on. Yes.
I worked on various campaigns in California. One was about it was like a millage to fund our local like public schools, and then different like local initiatives.
Awesome. And those kinds of sort of issue-based campaigns are not often when people think about working on campaigns, they think about working for a candidate. But there's a lot of issue-based campaigns and referendum, those kinds of things that can be really important. So a couple things to think about when engaging with electoral campaigns. Number one, if you're not signed up, you should totally come to the campaign school Friday and Saturday. We've still got a couple seats available. We'll talk about this ad nauseum. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the skills that we have as social workers are incredibly needed on campaigns. If you walk into a campaign office and you know how to engage with people, you know how to talk with a stranger, you know how to do active listening, you know how to do all those things that I remember learning in my first year IP class, you're going to be a huge, huge asset to a campaign. They will be very lucky to have you. The other thing is, if you walk into a campaign and I don't want to say it's not run well, because campaigns are sort of chaotic, but if you go into a campaign and you get a bad sense about the way they're doing things, or there's something about it that strikes you as wrong, it's a good opportunity to take a step back and say, what do I know about this candidate? What do I know about this issue? And sort of do a little gut check about whether or not it's a good place for you to be. A good campaign is going to give you work that you're supported in doing, you're trained in doing it. They're going to thank you when you're done with it. True of all other work that we do as social workers. And a good campaign is you're going to know how the work you're doing contributes to the overall goal. And those are really important things. I also would say in this current part of the election cycle, a lot of people are thinking about working on presidential campaigns, and those are really important, and I would never discourage you from doing it. But if you haven't picked a candidate, or you're not sure, or you're not feeling great about the presidential process, working on state and local races are hugely important. And in a presidential year, the presidential campaigns suck up all the volunteers, and it leaves a lot less for the other campaigns. So those campaigns would love, love, love to have you in 2020, and it's a really good way to get your feet wet. I know a lot of people who ended up in jobs working for elected officials because they started out as a volunteer on their campaigns. I have a good friend who's the deputy chief of staff for U.S. Senator, and her first job, we actually, as her internship, we placed her on a campaign, and then she went on to work for that campaign on a volunteer level, and then on a paid level. And then when he won, she went into his office as a constituent service person, and then worked her way up to deputy chief of staff. And that is really, being on the campaign and showing up and being a rock star is what sort of got the people in the office's attention. And gave her the chance that she had to do that for the career. So working on a campaign, if you're thinking of doing anything in the political world, is a really good place to start. And you don't have to commit to, you can go in for a couple hours on a Saturday or Sunday and see how it goes, right? You don't have to commit to working for that person full time for the rest of your life. You can sort of take it as it goes. I will tell you, for me, talking on the phone is maybe my least favorite thing in the world. Like, I frequently ignore phone calls from people that I'm, married to. The one person I'm married to, I guess I should clarify that. So phone calling on campaigns is not, I just don't enjoy it. But I'll knock on people's doors all day, because then you kind of get to see how people live. It's fun. I like people watching. It's like people watching in their houses. And I like to do everything else on a campaign. But I know that I will hate phone calls. That's totally fine. Then don't do that thing. There's lots and lots and lots of other ways. Unless Professor Hodge tells you to do it, in which case you should do whatever he tells you to do. So engaging with electoral campaigns is a really good step into political careers. Another really good step into political careers is an internship. And so for those of you who are still in the process, or you haven't figured out your internship for next year, it doesn't have to be an internship in an elected official's office, but a lot of the potential internship opportunities here will connect you with that sort of political world in a way that'll be really helpful for you in moving forward. And so if that's something you think you want to do and you haven't yet figured out your internships, that's definitely something that I would recommend. And I've spent a ton of my time trying to get interns in different sorts of political offices. The congressional, what does CRIS stand for? The Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. Their goal is to have at least one social worker in every elected official's office in DC. And I agree with Charles Lewis that I think that would be a tremendous asset for us as a field to have that. Plus, the field office would be thrilled with all of those new potential placements. All right, and the last domain is seeking and holding elected office. So why should social workers run for office? Oh, I'm asking you. Why should social workers run for office? Yes.
So we have a representative democracy.
Okay, so what does that mean?
So more people, I guess like everyday people that in our communities are taking leadership roles because they have our best interests at mind instead of having old white men running for office all the time.
And I think one of the things that I think is really valuable to remember is that there are essentially 3 career paths that the vast majority of elected officials at the federal level come from. They come from law, they come from business, and they come from like basically previous government service, right? Which I don't have anything against law, business, and government service. Those are all great things, right? But that's such a limited worldview of our country. And when 78% of the members of Congress are white men, that is, again, another limited worldview of our country. I remember when, who was it? I think it was when Barbara Lee joined the House of Representatives. Where's Barbara Lee? Is she not on the slide? Oh, in the top left. When Congresswoman Lee joined, she sat on a health committee, and they went around the room the first day and said, like, what are your priorities? And she was the last one, and they went around, and everybody talked about all these different kinds of cancers and health problems or whatever, and they got to her, and she said, breast cancer. And this was before we were putting any significant federal funding into breast cancer. And she said in an interview later, like, well, I guess you just needed to have breasts to remember that they were an important thing to talk about when we talk about health. And just such a good example of who's in the room makes a difference in terms of what are the issues that we talk about. And a lot of times we argue that having social workers around will also help the process. So we hope that that's true, right? We hope that social workers are going to bring all the skills that we have into the process and make it a better process. But we also know that it changes the issues that we talk about. If you have women in the room, we're more likely to talk about intimate partner violence. If you have people who have lived in poverty in the room, we're more likely to talk about homelessness. If you have people of color in the room, we're more likely to talk about racism, right? Like that, just who's in the room changes the conversation. It changes what's on the agenda. And so as social workers, part of the reason that I think social workers are a phenomenal pool to bring elected officials from is that our social workers either come from or have worked with people who have lived in all those different kinds of experiences, and so we can bring those with us into the process of seeking and holding office. The extreme example of this is a woman I met from Maine who was running for office, and she brought with her the paperwork to apply for SNAP and Medicaid with her to every door she knocked. Her campaign hated it. Hated it, because she was like spending an hour at each house talking them through like how to apply for SNAP and how to apply for food stamp. And I do have to say, she didn't win, but the connection, like those people still come and find her, right? Like she's still working in advocacy, she's still working in the political world, and those people know her and they remember her. And she said, I can't show up at these people's houses, know the problems that they have, and not spend some time helping them, problem solve some solutions to them. Now, not every social worker is going to do that when they're running for office, and probably they shouldn't if they want to win. But it is a good example of how having social workers involved makes a difference. I have to use this quote from Debbie Stabenow. I don't just use it when I'm in Michigan, but I got to use it when I'm in Michigan. It's easier to spend a few months and some money electing the right people than to spend years and a lot of money trying to get the wrong people to do the right things. Do you know what this picture is behind Debbie? It's from Hamilton. This is the song, I Want to Be in the Room Where It Happens, right? We can spend all of our time trying to convince elected officials to talk about the things we want them to talk about. We can spend all of our time trying to convince elected officials to make our voting system more accessible. We could totally do that. Or we could get some more social workers elected and know that the people who are in that room already have those priorities on their mind. It's just so much more efficient. And I think sometimes we think, well, I don't want to run for Senate. I don't want to run for governor. I don't want to run for whatever. But it doesn't just have to be those big offices, right? Like in my spare time, it is literally a 3-hour-a-week job. I'm the deputy registrar of voters for my town, which is sort of like being a clerk here, I'm told. So like my job is to you'll be surprised, talk to people about registering to vote and make sure everybody knows their voting rights and help them register if they have questions and make sure that our elections are held in a way that they're accessible to everybody. And like literally 3 hours a week, unless there's an election, and then it's like a 17-hour day. And then I'm very tired. But for the most part, it's 3 hours a week. But I'm in the room when we're making decisions about, are we going to set up the accessible voting system? And where are we going to put the door for people who need help getting in the room? And are we going to make curbside voting accessible to people? State law says we can, but we don't have to. I say we are going to, right? So I'm in the room, I'm making those decisions, and it makes a difference in how we do it. So I'm a big fan of this, not just because it's Hamilton, although I do love Hamilton, and because in my dissertation in 2008, I did a study of social workers who had run for office. And what I found is that social workers who ran for office were more white than the general population of social workers, but much more likely to be people of color than your typical elected official. So this was sort of like testing out this theory that social workers are a good pool to pull from to try to make people more diverse. One thing that I did find in this group was that they were much more likely than I had expected to be over the age of 53. So if you look at here, 75% of this group were over the age of 53. So what we learned from this is that most of the social workers that we had surveyed ran for office as like a second career. So often after they'd retired or as their career was slowing down, they ran for office after their kids got older. And as I said, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. I understand that, right? It's hard to get out to campaign and knock on doors and do things when you've got kids at home. But I also think part of this is that there's some really big barriers for young people and particular parents and particular moms to getting on the ballot. When I sit on the nominating committee in my town for town offices and I say, hey, how about Jennifer? I think Jennifer would be great on the school board. She's got 2 kids in school already. The response is, she has a little one at home. She's not going to have time for that. What about this dude? And I'm in the room, so I can say, well, how about we ask her if she has time before we assume she doesn't have time? And I roll my eyes, but only internally, like not at them. I try. But we still have a real need to make sure that even among social workers that we are looking at potential elected officials from a much bigger range. Yes?
Is there any data on what those social workers did in like their first career? Like were they interpersonal clinical track or were they doing macro work before they ran for office?
Yes, and I deleted that slide this morning. But I can tell you, so my expectation was that they were going to be macro people. Like in their social work education and in their careers, they were going to be macro people. I was wrong. And I really hate being wrong, but I was wrong. It turned out that the biggest group were people who had actually come out of generalist programs, and that the people, like sort of this micro-macro split was even. There were just as many social workers who had run for office who had been, whether it's IP here or casework or direct practice in other places, majors, as there were people who were macro majors. And I think some of that has to do with, I have a lot of thoughts about why that might be. I think some of that is because a lot of social workers, even if they're IP majors, they end up in macro practice later in their careers, and so their careers move them in that trajectory. But I also think that a lot of direct practitioners are really like front and center with the problems that we're talking about, and so they see those effects on populations, and so they might be more motivated to try to do something about it. Anyway, those are my 2 thoughts about that, why that might be. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't know if I have any like unique thoughts about it, but I'm just thinking about like even within clinical practice, there are often like, I don't know, chip on a shoulder is like a little harsh way to say it, but just like being given policies that you have to implement that add hours to your week and like hundreds of different forms that you have to fill out. Maybe being a motivator to even like, I was thinking as far as like domains of political social work, there are like politics within agencies that parallel a lot with like government agencies, and thinking about like collective bargaining at like the higher level of that, but also just like pushing back on agency policies.
Yeah. Well, so this is a little bit of a rant. but you're trapped here with me, so you're stuck with it. So when we talk about self-care in social work, we often talk about self-care as like, you know, make sure you get enough sleep and like take a bubble bath now and then, right? Except that we know that one of the major contributors to burnout is systems that make us feel like we're banging our head against the wall every day. And so self-care for me, and I think for a lot of people who end up sort of spending some of their time in the macro space is, well, I don't really want to go home and have a glass of wine or a bottle of wine to feel better. I want to change these policies that are making me feel like crap, and that's my form of self-care. And so I do think that that idea that, like, I mean, when we talk to people who are in full-on burnout and are leaving agencies, they don't just talk about like the hours are long. They talk about the lack of resources. They talk about the agency policies. They talk about sort of the systemic issues that are affecting them. And I think for some people, figuring out how to change those systemic systems, you know what I mean, might be a way to address those feelings of burnout. So that's one thought. Other thoughts? It was a good question, thank you. So particularly in this political climate, I thought it was interesting to point out, A, that this is what we know about the political ideology of social workers, and B, that both of these numbers are from 2008. I can't tell you anything about the political ideology of social workers more recently than 2008. So I can tell you in 2008, this is my sample, and this is another study that was done just to try to have some comparison of licensed social workers, that social workers were more likely to identify as liberal than anything else. Pretty substantial number identify as moderate, and a relatively small number identify as conservative. I don't actually think this is accurate today. I think there's a bigger number of people who identify as conservative than is in here. I think they're often just not, they don't feel comfortable talking about their political views within the profession, and so they sort of go underground. But I think this is a conversation we have to continue to have, because the idea that bringing social workers into the political system will create social change does not necessarily have to have a single political philosophy attached to it. That social change might look different for different social workers who are all using the same code of ethics and the same set of values, but are coming from different life experiences. And I think we don't have those conversations as much as we should. And this is just, I think, to your point about sort of people who are micro or IP. I asked the people in my study, what are the social work skills that were most helpful for you? Now, please keep in mind, I teach policy and research. Do you see policy and research on this list? No, nowhere. They said the things that were most helpful for them from their social work education were communication skills, active listening, conflict management, and learning how to bargain and compromise. None of which I teach in my classes, but I think are really important as part of that conversation we have about why social workers are good to be in the political system, is that these are really important skills to have in the political process, and having social workers bring those in is really important. All right, I wouldn't be me if I let you go without saying to you, if you have not yet thought about running for office, you need to run for office. Professor Hodge is excluded. He's thought about running for office. Excellent. You've thought about it, yes. Often people have to be asked multiple times before they really see themselves as a candidate for office. So I'm asking you, I would like it if everyone in this room ran for office, because if the elected officials in our community were made up of the people in this room, I absolutely 100% believe, without having met all of you individually, that our community would be better off. So a lot of people say, I'm not sure I'm qualified. You're qualified. You either have a degree or are about to have a degree from an amazing school in a degree that well prepares you. A lot of people say, nobody ever asked me. Okay, you can't say that. You've been asked. And a lot of people say, and I hope you wouldn't think this ever, but hope you don't think it anymore, like, well, what expertise do I have? But I think we've talked about, right? Like, you have the expertise of knowing your community and the people that you work with, and your community will be better off if people like you are in the political system and sitting there going toe-to-toe with the lawyers and the business people and the other people who are bringing in their expertise, and making sure that that set of ideas is a little bit more well-rounded. All right. It is 1:51. I'm going to make you do a group activity. I know. It's a group act. It's good. All right. So grab the other people at your table, and if your table has abandoned you, go find a different table. And I want you to take a look at this ethical dilemma and tell me what you think the social worker should do. So you're the campaign manager for a candidate in a tight election. You recently discovered that as a college student, your opponent spent several days as a patient in an inpatient mental health facility. Given the prevalence of mental health stigma in your community, releasing this information is likely to turn voters away from your opponent. Do you share it with the local paper, or do you keep it to yourself? 2 minutes, talk to the people around you, and then tell me what you think. This caused an almost knockdown, drag-out fight in one of my classes once. It's my favorite thing to do. Not the fighting part. Fighting is bad. Violence is never the answer. I hear some creative answers coming around here. All right, what do we think? Would it be ethical for you as a social worker to release this information? Okay, we got a no over there. Why not? Okay, it doesn't fit with values. Okay, what else? What other people think? Okay, so get the information out and let people do with it what they will. What about you guys? You also decided to share it? Okay. How about you guys? Did you come to? Okay, you got a maybe and some hard no's. All right, how about over here? Because it's not your information to share. Okay. Oh, so you could share yours and then be like, I put my information out there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, if this was as a college student, like he broke his leg, we wouldn't even be having the conversation, right? So this dilemma, I think, wraps in that like everything that we do in the political world has these layers of ethics wrapped within them, right? And these stigmas that we have to figure out how we're gonna negotiate. So, and we could talk about this for a really long time. I just wanted to do this one quickly, and then I wanted to stop and see what questions people have. You guys have stuck it out through the end. If I had like bonus treats, I would totally give them out.
What's the best argument you've heard for either side of this question?
Oh, the best argument I heard for share the information is that this guy is going to be making decisions about mental health in the community, and he's making those with these stigmas in mind. And the best argument for the other side was that we know that this will be used in a way that will stigmatize more people in their mental health, and that's not ethical to do it. Oh, okay. That's okay. What did you? Oh, okay. Oh, your own. Okay. And you would feel comfortable doing that? If the candidate was comfortable. Yeah. 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 But let me tell you why. So one of the most powerful like advocacy moments I've ever seen was in the state capitol in Connecticut. We were debating a bill about contraception for survivors of sexual assault, and a state rep got up and talked about her own experience with sexual assault when she was in college, and it was literally the first time she'd ever told anyone other than her husband about this experience. And it was one of those days that like I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And we had been fighting, and we had like big lobbies on the other side because like the Catholic Church didn't want to have to do it. There were like healthcare people were like we were definitely on the uphill battle of that. And her being willing to talk openly about her experience was like absolutely a game changer. Deb Heinrich, she's amazing. So yeah, I agree with you. It's when it's your own information, choosing how to use it feels very different than outing somebody else. You're like, wait, what's wrong? We're having a different conversation. Both are good conversations to have. All right, other questions? You want to talk about some next steps, what you can do when you leave this room? All right, let's do that. All right. So, the Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work has a ton of resources on their website. We send out newsletters. You can go to the website and learn more, or talk to me and I'll put you on their website. But it's a great way to just learn about, they send out stuff about voting, about running for office, about all this stuff. Also, the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, which is all the voting and social work stuff that you see comes from them. They also have a mailing list and a lot of great resources. And they're specific to social workers, to our field placements, to our schools of social work, to lots of really good things. This is not just political social work, but sort of just a more macro thing in general. We are about to have our first ever national macro social work conference in May at WashU, which is another decent school of social work, I guess. And it would be awesome if you could all come. There's a student rate for it. There's going to be presentations about community organizing, about management, about policy, about politics. It's going to be a great time. I also am, just for clarity, I'm the co-chair of it, and please come. We put a ton of work into it. It's going to be awesome. You should be there. Huh? Yes. And then, although this feels really uncomfortable to me, as Justin mentioned, I wrote a book. I wrote 2 books now. The second one is Social Welfare Policy in a Changing World. They are, however, priced as textbooks because there are only so many things I have control over. But there is a flyer for the first one. The second one just came out. And if you want segments from any of them, don't tell my publisher, but I'm happy to share stuff with you if there's something in there that's useful for you. Justin is the only person in the world who has 3 copies of the first one who's not me. And Justin actually helped with the online resources for the second book, so it was really great. And then here's my last thing is I think the most important thing to remember in political social work, because there are bad days, just like there are in every other kind of social work, is to remember why you do it. So this is I have 2 daughters. On the left is Caroline, and then in the stroller on the right is Kathleen. They have been going to political events and marching in parades and entertaining themselves in the back of speeches for their entire lives. I presume this will happen for the rest of their entire lives, and they are really good sports about it. But what it also means for me is that they interact pretty much on a regular basis with people who hold power in our communities. And so they are going to grow up very differently from I did, with a sense that those people care about them and that their voices are important to those people. And that's really important to me, and that's why I continue to do this. So I would encourage you to think about ways that you can sort of hang on to your purpose as you do political work. And that's what I got. Thank you. Look at that. 2 o'clock on the dot. I would like a medal. Is it a cutting board?